Good morning, you all. I hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I'm Jess Cannell, and I hope to earn your subscription today. I already feel it. We have a very heavy topic today. Now, in one way, it's a wonderful topic. We are going to be talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I'm actually really excited to dig into his life a little bit more. But one thing that I do feel the weight of is he's such an important figure. He was so influential. He has been idolized, he has been demonized, he has been maligned, and he was certainly, as we talked about in a recent video, attacked by our own government. And if you're interested in that, you may want to go back. About 2 weeks ago, we went ahead and I did a little analysis of Trump's executive orders where he's releasing the documents regarding the JFK assassination, the MLK assassination, and the Robert F. Kennedy assassination. And so I did a little talk through of that, but one of the things that we talked about in there is the way that he was bugged and monitored by the FBI and had been threatened by our own CIA. So as we talk about him, there's a lot to consider, not just the man and his legacy, not just the facts of his assassination, but the fact that as a thought leader in a crucial role in American history, he was actually being worked on by our own government. And so hopefully this magazine will at least get into that in part. I have not looked at it. Whenever we do these old magazines, I choose to review it with you and be surprised or amazed right alongside you. So let's go ahead and get into it. I just opened up and looked at the table of contents and did a very quick browse of the magazine. And we are about to get some wonderful images and quotes and stories that are going to carry us along through his life and work. So I'm ready to get into it with you. The first is the march in Washington, and look at the Capitol back there in the background. That's a really interesting composition of a photo. But there we have the March on Washington. 50 years after his death was when this was published. This is an article called Then and Now by John Meacham. The setting was splendid, the congregation rapt, the preacher at ease. It was the morning of Sunday, March 31st, 1968, the last Sunday before the beginning of Holy Week, and Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had come to Washington's National Cathedral to offer a Lenten sermon. Easter was 2 weeks away, but King's mind was more on the world beyond the cathedral's splendid rose window than the details on the Christian calendar. Standing in the ornate Canterbury pulpit, gazing out across the sprawling nave, King summoned his listeners to the hard work of the gospel. I don't know why I didn't realize that he had given this in that location. Very interesting. Here's what he said. We are tied together in the single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, and whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the way God's universe is made. This is the way it is structured. He would be dead before the week was out. So they take us right into the tension of his action, his desire, not just that he can be who he wants to be, but that who I am, ultimately who I can be, what I can achieve is inextricably tied to who you are, who you're becoming, what you will allow your society to be. That's a really wise insight, of course. Here he says, this is his sermon in that place. In that last Sunday sermon in Washington, he spoke of America and of her obligations. To whom much is given, the The scriptures tell us much is expected of individuals and of nations. One day we will have to stand before God and we will talk in terms of things we've done. Yes, we will be able to say we built gargantuan bridges to span the seas. We built gigantic buildings to kiss the skies. We made our submarines to penetrate ocean depths. We brought into being, with many other things, our scientific and technological power. It seems that I can hear the God of history saying, "That was not enough. But I was hungry, and ye fed me not. I was naked, and ye clothed me not. I was devoid of a decent sanitary house to live in, and ye provided no shelter for me. And consequently, you cannot enter the kingdom of greatness. If ye do it unto the least of these, my brethren, you do it to me." That's the question facing America today. We are given in this article, I can see, details about the movement, that they were battling Jim Crow, that there was economic justice being pursued in the 50s and 60s, that he was a fiery apostle. Prodded by the movement's nonviolent protests, President Kennedy and particularly Johnson built on President Truman's civil rights work to pass 2 landmark bills attacking Jim Crow and securing voting rights for all. So, yes, his work was important. It was significant. He crossed paths with and partnered with presidents and great men in our nation. And he worked from the small to the powerful to achieve the goals that he had. Very inspiring figure. This says, in 1956 in Montgomery, King celebrated being convicted of conspiracy to boycott city buses, a protest that began after Rosa Parks refused to give her seat to a white person. Ordinarily, a person leaving a courtroom with a conviction behind him would wear a somber face, King said, but I left with a smile. I knew that I was a convicted criminal, but I was proud of my crime. Here he is at the Lincoln Memorial. This speech in 1957 was called "Give Us the Ballot." It was his first before a national audience, and it would foreshadow his "I Have a Dream" speech 6 years later at the same site. I did not realize that he had given a speech so early in the same place. That still is a vast crowd, isn't it? Here we have his body being pulled on a mule-drawn cart. It says the body of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in a funeral procession through the streets of Atlanta, his hometown, on April 9th, 1968. The 3-mile procession went from a private service at Ebenezer Baptist Church, where King and his father had been pastors, to a public service at Morehouse College, his alma mater. King had been assassinated April 4th in Memphis. You know, in myself, what I would love to do is do all of the happy things first, all of the inspiring things first, because that would be easier to present and to read to you, to say all of the amazing things that he did. However, I think by weaving these things together, it makes it more powerful because, of course, we know that his life was cut short, and we know that it was cut short at perhaps the height of his power, that he was changing hearts, influencing the nation, and doing so in a way that was admirable. The Bible tells us to do what is respectable in the eyes of all, and his nonviolent, aspirational words reached hearts that would not have been reached through just violent protest. And so his particular angle on how to address these things was threatening and was effective. And so to have the inspirational interwoven with the reality of the loss of him is actually, I think, appropriate. It's just going to be more emotionally difficult to work through this book. Here we have the dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, that all men are created equal. Drawing on the Bible and My Country 'Tis of Thee, on the Emancipation Proclamation and the Constitution, king projected an ideal vision of an exceptional nation. In doing so, he defined the best of the nation. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a desert state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. If you haven't listened to it recently, I would encourage you to go find a spot where you can sit alone and a time where you can focus in without distraction and pull up. I mean, on YouTube, there's, probably dozens of videos of that moment, but listen to the speech, listen to his heart and his approach in giving that speech. And you'll be inspired not only as an orator, but as a thinker and as someone who, like they just pointed out, can weave together such a variety of influences and ideas to inspire and educate and call out and provoke thought to his listener. There's this tension that is written about here in this section. King, who craved forward motion, had spoken of delay and of dreams deferred. The pilgrimage would be long, he had told his listeners, and the pilgrims had to maintain the moral high ground they had so effectively claimed through nonviolence. Yeah, it's such a difficult thing to live in tension. We all want resolution in relationships, in life, and certainly in things of life and justice. We want things to be on the other side of it, done. And here he is grappling with this reality of time. Time is going to be needed, that people who have been educated by their grandparents and parents with racist hatred of other human beings isn't going to disappear in a summer. That he knew that it would take generations, it would take time. And that's such an uncomfortable place to sit. It's a wise observation, but it's a terrible one. Of course, he did summon the nation to justice. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and every mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. That's a position of hope, and it is a pulling of a biblical idea that each will not be allowed to remain as they are. And so those who are in a humble posture, that there is joy for them. In fact, he says, blessed are the meek, right? Or blessed are the poor. He spoke blessing on people who were in what we would perceive as negative states, that they will be exalted, and that there is a humbling coming to anyone who thinks they stand. And he had those not just religious ideas, but he knew that eventually they will also be true socially and politically, but he saw far off. He was saying, it may not be in my lifetime. So this is actually a time special edition. And so what they do for us is they give us, in its original printing, the January 3rd, 1964 Times Man of the Year article in its original wording. So for example, it starts out by saying, it was the year of the Negro Revolution. Birmingham was its main battleground, and Martin Luther King Jr., the leader of the Negroes in Birmingham, became to millions the symbol of that revolution. King is in many ways the unlikely leader of an unlikely organization. He earns no more than some plumbers, $10,000 a year, and possesses little in the way of material things. He preaches endlessly about nonviolence, but his protest movements often lead to violence. He himself has been stabbed in the chest and physically attacked 3 more times. His home has been bombed 3 times, and he has been pitched into jail 14 times. His mail brings him a daily dosage of opinion in which he is by turn vilified and glorified. Oh, this is 4 years before he would be assassinated, but they quote an article that says, "This isn't a threat, but a promise. Your head will be blown off, as sure as Christ made green apples." But then another ecstatically calls him a Moses sent to lead his people to the promised land of first-class citizenship. We're going to a picture of him there, 1965. A bright student, he entered Atlanta's Negro Morehouse College at age 15. His father wanted him to study for the ministry. King thought he wanted medicine or the law. I had doubts that religion was intellectually respectable. I revolted against the emotionalism of Negro religion, the shouting and the stamping. I didn't understand it, and it embarrassed me. At Morehouse, he searched for, quote, some intellectual basis for a social philosophy. He read and reread Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience, and he concluded that the ministry was the only framework on which he could position his growing ideas on social protest. Interesting. Here we have him being released on bail, and of course the response to protesters. In Birmingham, there was response by dogs, fire hoses, tear gas, and arrests. The first big test of King's philosophy came in 1955 after he had married Coretta Scott and accepted the pastorate of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. On that same year, in December, a seamstress named Rosa Parks boarded a Montgomery bus and took a seat. When the driver told Mrs. Parks to get up, she refused. "I don't really know why I wouldn't move," she said later. "There was no plot or plan at all. I was just tired from shopping. My feet hurt." She was arrested and fined $10. Within hours, the Negroes were embarked upon a boycott that almost ruined Montgomery's bus line. The boycott committee became the Montgomery Improvement Association, with Martin Luther King Jr. its president. King's home was bombed, and when his enraged people seemed ready to take to the streets in a riot of protest, he controlled them with his calm preaching of nonviolence. In less than a year, the Supreme Court upheld an earlier order forbidding Jim Crow separate but equal seating in Alabama buses. Montgomery was one of the first great battles won by the Negro in the South. Yes, antiquated language. But it's interesting the way that they show and trace King's influence in the movement, that just about the time people are ready to rise up, his pastorly tone, but not just the tone, the actual undergirding of the philosophy that he had, that the way that we win respect is through nonviolent action, by giving them nothing to pin on us. That is a hard standard to live up to, and it is admirable that that is what he held up as honorable and called people to. It's quite amazing. There is so much history here in these pages. It mentions protests. It mentions the crisis of jailing and armored cars and fire hoses. Everywhere, King's presence was demanded. But while he preached nonviolence, violence spread. Freedom walker William Moore was shot and killed in Alabama. Mississippi's NAACP leader Medgar Evers was assassinated outside his home. There was violence in Mississippi, in Maryland, in Virginia, in Birmingham. The church bomb went off. These events awakened long slumbering Negro resentments from which a fresh urgency drew strength. For the first time, a unanimity of purpose slammed into the Negro consciousness. Class lines began to shatter. middle-class Negroes who were aspiring for acceptance by the white community suddenly found a point of identity with Negroes at the bottom of the economic heap. Many wealthy Negroes, once reluctant to join the fight, pitched in. Many whites also began to participate, particularly the white clergy, which cast off its lethargy, tucked the scriptures under their arms, and marched to jails with Negroes whom they had never seen before. They list some of those pastors. President Kennedy, who had been in no great hurry to produce a civil rights bill, now moved swiftly. The Justice Department drew up a bill aimed particularly at voting rights, employment, and the end of segregation in public facilities. To cap the summer's great storm of protest, the Negro leaders sponsored the now famous March on Washington. It was a remarkable spectacle, one of disorganized order. Some 200,000 strong, whites and blacks of all ages walked from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. There, the leaders spoke. But it was King who most dramatically articulated grievances, and it was he who would be remembered the longest. King's seminal speech to the thousands gathered cried out for the freedom and the equality that had long been denied them. He ended with the words of a spiritual: free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Here we have that image of white and black church leaders in particular joining together. In 1963, he began preparing for 1964 and the activities there. He spends much of his time in airplanes journeying to far corners of the U.S. to speak to huge audiences. He traveled about 275,000 miles in 1963 and made more than 350 speeches. Wherever he goes, the threat of death hovers. I just don't worry about things like this, he says. If I did, I just couldn't get anything done. He had a gun in Montgomery, but got rid of it. I sat down with Coretta one night and we talked about it. I pointed out that as a leader of a nonviolent movement, I had no right to have a gun, so I got rid of it. The quality, not the longevity of one's life, is what is important. If you are cut down in a movement that is designed to save the soul of a nation, then no other death could be more redemptive. Whew. Heavy, heavy words. Many times when you listen to Dr. King's words, there is a foreboding and a premonition that seems to take over him, where he recognizes that his life won't go on forever. And one in particular, of course, is very famous, where he specifically knows he may not go with them. We get to the time of the march to Montgomery. We have him here marching. And the quote says, "Let us march on segregated housing. Let us march on segregated schools. Let us march on poverty. Let us march on ballot boxes until race baiters disappear from the political arena." There's a section of this magazine that takes the movie Selma and details from it and compares the movie details with the real life details. And in this section, there is a little bit that talks about infidelity and FBI monitoring. And so I want to share some of that with you. It says King did have mistresses, and he was, in fact, engaging in an extramarital affair. He later confessed to his wife, and presumably did, considering the anonymous letters that got mailed to her home. She had suspicions in 1965, but there were other stressors on their marriage as well, because of the constant death threats and the threats she felt against their home and their children. Also, the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, despised Martin Luther King Jr. and started bugging his offices and phone lines when he suspected that King was a communist. The Nobel Committee's decision to honor King with the Peace Prize bothered Hoover to no end, and he was the one who authorized the blackmail package that advised King to commit rather than having his dirty laundry aired in public. "You are done," the letter threatened. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation. So he was threatened. He was monitored. I don't know about you, but it's really helpful to me to see photography from the time. And as I look at some of this, I feel very much that you need to see it. One is a sharecropper's home on the way to Montgomery. And you can see the mother and baby there in the window. This type of home feels a million miles away to me. And yet that was reality for those who were living at the time, showing up to protest. Here's another father and son, and then school children outside of a school building. And I just noticed even in their school building, the holes in the roof. This is certainly not even the separate but equal type of standard, much less a upright, well-built school for these children. It's helpful to remind ourselves what was true and not superimpose what we know now back into that moment. He did say, this was his last speech, "I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." He used that biblical idea, which if you're not a Christian or a Jew, you might not know this, but the idea of crossing over the river into the promised land is one that obviously the Israelites had, of wandering in the wilderness, but then crossing over the river to get to the land that God had promised them. It's also a picture of heaven that the Bible presents, of that we will cross over the river of death into a place of peace and rest and final joy and getting everything right in the promised land. And so he used that picture to call his listeners to action and to change that's needed in order to get where you want to go. Well, now we get to the assassination. It says the loss of a transformative life. Here, you can't fully see his body. He is laying here on the balcony, but this is the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. I have stood out in the parking lot here. I don't know. I'm sure the building is still up, I guess, for a historical purpose, but I went in college, I remember. It says 50 years after his assassination, King's dream of equality for all remains elusive. An article by Douglas Blackman. In the early evening of April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the balcony outside his room at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee, enjoying the cool air with some of his closest advisors and friends. They had just dressed for a dinner of soul food at the home of a nearby supporter. Someone teased young Jesse Jackson, Jr. about his hip new threads. King suggested a particular gospel song for an event later that night. His driver told him to grab a coat, since the night might get chilly. There was no inkling that these were the final seconds and words of King's life. At 6:01 p.m., a single rifle shot fired from 250 feet away tore catastrophically through King's jaw, neck, and torso. He lived for another hour, but didn't speak again. This photograph was taken just moments after he was shot. As word of his death spread across the country, a wave of violent unrest rolled through scores of U.S. cities. In Washington, D.C. alone, at least 1,000 buildings burned before thousands of protesters turned back in the face of 17,000 police and federal troops. For many African Americans, the murder confirmed that even after all the reforms of the previous decade, their country might never fully accept the equality of Black citizens. At the same time, King was transformed by his murder into a universal martyr and one of the most revered figures in all of American history. Indeed, here we have 4 days after his assassination, his widow and closest associates led a massive march through Memphis. We have his daughter, Yolanda, King's sons, Coretta Scott King, Ralph Abernathy, Jesse Jackson, and others are all there. On the evening before his murder, King gave his legendary Mountaintop sermon to a packed house at the historically Black Mason Temple in Memphis. He told the crowd that the movement's struggle was no longer limited to civil rights. God has commanded us to be concerned about the slums down here and his children who can't eat 3 square meals a day, King said. But the prescription he endorsed was never filled. Rattled by civil disturbances of 1968, youth unrest, and protests, American leaders gravitated to the law and order obsession that would incarcerate so many millions of their citizens. Here we have Beale Street demonstrations happening in Memphis just about a week before he was assassinated. Ghosts of Memphis. On the 40th anniversary of King's assassination, the men who were with him on April 4th, 1968, share their memories. We were all young people, Reverend Billy Kyles recalled, of that fateful evening in Memphis, Tennessee. They were vivid, vigorous, virile young men. In his last hour alive, King and his friends had a pillow fight in his motel room. I didn't know that. History records that his last thoughts encompassed gospel music, neckties, soul food, and the high price of righteousness. I'd rather be dead than afraid, this haunted man explained to his friends that very day. Here are some of the memories. Kyles had asked for King's help with the sanitation workers' strike in Memphis. The night before the assassination, he stood on the pulpit with King during his famous Mountaintop speech. He died on April 26, 2016, at the age of 81 after decades pastoring Memphis's monumental Baptist church and doing civil rights work. In an interview with Time in 2008, he recalled showing the Lorraine Motel to Nelson Mandela, who wept as he said, "This is where Martin died." His recollection that day was, "I thought I was having a nightmare. 40 years ago, I had no words to express my feelings. 40 years later, I still have no words to express how I felt." Reverend James Bevel, a brilliant tactician who was an activist until dying of cancer in 2008, he said that day, "I got this friend named Bernard Lafayette, and Bernard would always do tricks. So my first impression was that Bernard had shot a firecracker. But it was like, Martin doesn't play like that." So that's what he thought had happened. Reverend Jesse Jackson about that day says, "The police were coming toward us with their guns drawn. We were saying, oh, when they're pointing, it came from that way. You should be running with the guns toward where the bullet came from." Wow, interesting. That photo points out what's happening. They are all pointing. So he's describing for us why they were pointing. That makes sense. Whew. Andrew Young, when he came out, he didn't have a top coat. And I said, "It's cool. You better go back and get your top coat." And he was saying, "Do I really need a coat?" And then the shot rang out. The magazine has a lot more in it about the work of civil rights that has been done, the effect of incarceration and civil rights efforts from the time and how they have been answered or non-answered in our time. But to keep a tight focus on him, his life, and his assassination, I'm just going to focus in there. I do want to point out that now there is a monument on the National Mall dedicated to Martin Luther King Jr. It's called the Stone of Hope, and it puts his words in granite so that they can be read by all. We're given a final look with the photo at that day of the I Have a Dream speech from the March on Washington. So we will leave it there. Our look at this amazing man, inspiring, with such a vision for the future that still, in many ways, needs to be achieved. Some of what he hoped for has been answered. Some is yet to come. As far as his assassination goes and the things that I would hope to hear from the documents that are going to be released, I think the thing that we all wonder the most is what has been hidden. So if there was any government involvement in anything regarding his assassination, I hope that in the way that President Trump said when he talked about the JFK files being released, he said it would bring about a national cleansing and that it's time. I don't know if he would say those same things about these two men and their assassinations. However, if our government had anything to do with the assassination itself or the assassin himself, if there was any training involved, if there was any threats or influence involved, if there were any black ops, military operations, or, tangential to the government, if there's anything like that, I sincerely hope, even though it would be a terrible thing to learn, I hope that the government would finally, 60 plus years later, tell us the truth about that. That's my hope. Well, I guess it's actually been, let me think, it's been 62 years since JFK's assassination. I suppose it's been 57 years since MLK and RFK's assassinations. And like we talked about, the thing that President Trump signed means that 15 days after that executive order, the Director of National Intelligence and the AG, the Attorney General, have to present a plan for the JFK files to be released. And 45 days after his signing, the plan has to be presented about these two men. And so that's what we are awaiting. We are not told whether or not we are going to hear about that plan on that day. I believe it's around March 8th is that 45-day mark. The executive order says that they will present the plan 45 days after his signing. So it very well could be the case that some documents are released right off the bat. That very well could happen, that there are some things that upon quick review, they find this doesn't actually contain anything that the American people can't know now. There may be some things that they say, well, these few, we need to run by these people and make sure that it's okay for, I don't know all of the ins and outs, but I do know that they talk about things like sources and methods, that even if there's something like where, say, they interviewed a woman who lived nearby the motel, and let's say that woman is still alive, or it gives her address, or it gives personal information about her. Those are the kinds of things where they might have still remained classified. There may be also, of course, nefarious reasons why they have remained classified. But over time, I do hope, my personal hope is that by midsummer, by late summer, that the vast majority of the documents in all three instances have been released. I don't fully know what to expect, but that's kind of my expectation, that by the end of the summer 2025, that perhaps by then we will have the bulk of files released on all three assassinations so that we can get on and walk in the truth and understand whether or not our government had anything to do with, even if it was just the threats that we talked about, which were horrible and shouldn't have been done, but by our FBI and CIA, even if it's just threats, and then perhaps the assassin worked alone. I just want to know those things. What are you wondering about? What do you hope for from the document files that will be released? And what did you learn about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. through this little look? It's a very quick overview, but I hope you still were reminded of things about him and about his role in the civil rights movement that edified you and that made you better prepared for the release of those documents. I do want to let you know, while this is my first look specifically at Martin Luther King Jr., I do have an entire playlist dedicated to the JFK assassination, and we have gone through key players in that, personalities, and we've even read through a moment-by-moment account that was pieced together by a man named William Manchester of the assassination. And there's already 5 parts to that series, and we have 5 more parts coming in March. So I want to point you to that playlist. There is great content there where you can dig into your heart's content about the JFK assassination. I hope you'll come back next time for this talk about Robert F. Kennedy. We're going to do the very same thing, read through some articles about his life, his legacy, and ultimately get ourselves a little bit familiar with his assassination and the facts about it so that we're prepared for whatever comes in the documents. I hope you have a great day. Bye.